They thought the courtroom would finally silence him, but instead, it exposed secrets he never meant to spill. The air was heavy, thick with the kind of tension that doesn't come from shouting, but from silence stretched too tight. Every cough echoed, every paper shuffle felt like thunder. And right there, under the cold stare of the law, a prince who once commanded palaces looked painfully, shockingly human. Not triumphant, not powerful, cornered. He walked in carrying years of rage against the press, years of interviews, documentaries, speeches about betrayal and trauma. This was supposed to be the moment everything he'd claimed would be validated under oath. Instead, the cracks started showing before lunch. It began with a simple question, a name, a whisper from the past, Mr. Mischief. For years, rumors swirled that he had used that cheeky alias to secretly communicate with journalists. Quiet chats, backdoor conversations. The very kind of press interaction he publicly condemned. When asked directly, he shut it down instantly. Flat denial, absolute, no hesitation. And then the receipts arrived. Not from tabloids, not from enemies, from people who once stood inside his inner circle. Old allies, former friends, messages, references, private notes that pointed straight back to that same secret nickname. Suddenly, the denial didn't look confident. It looked fragile. The courtroom didn't gasp, but the silence deepened, like everyone felt the shift at once. This wasn't just a detail. This was dynamite. Because his entire case leaned on one central image, a man relentlessly hunted, never participating, never playing the game. But evidence suggested he wasn't just prey. Sometimes, he may have been stepping into the arena willingly, even if it was complicated, even if it was messy. The judge didn't explode. He didn't need to. A raised brow, a pause before writing a note. That quiet judicial restraint hit harder than outrage ever could. As questions tightened, so did his posture. He shifted in the witness box, jaw clenching, eyes flicking toward his legal team more often. Every time he tried to zoom out to talk about the toxic culture, the cruelty, the lifelong siege, he was gently but firmly dragged back to specifics. Dates, times, documents, not feelings, facts. And that's when frustration started leaking through the cracks. He wanted to explain the whole storm, the fear, the paranoia, the way it felt to grow up hunted. But the courtroom didn't want the storm. It wanted raindrops counted and cataloged. Each story he tried to broaden got sliced back down to one narrow, uncomfortable point. Can you prove this particular claim? The clash wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It was procedural. Then came the emotional turn. And this is where things got complicated in a way nobody could spin cleanly. When he described the personal toll of media intrusion, the memories poured out fast. His voice thickened. His words stumbled over old pain. But as he spoke, he lingered, really lingered, on past relationships, former girlfriends, the distress they endured, the guilt he still carried. It was raw, it was detailed, it was heartfelt, and it was noticeably longer than when he later mentioned his wife. That moment didn't need commentary. The contrast hung there on its own, awkward and unavoidable. In a case already wobbling under credibility questions, optics like that hit hard. By afternoon, the rhythm of the day was clear. Every time he reached for the bigger moral argument, the injustice, the lifelong suffering, the defense calmly placed another document on the table. Emails, notes, testimony from former staff that painted a more strategic relationship with the media than a simple victim narrative allowed. One especially brutal line of questioning circled around internal tactics used by his own team, changing phone numbers, feeding selective information, monitoring leaks, defensive moves, sure, but still moves, still engagement, still participation in the very ecosystem he claimed only harmed him. He pushed back, called it survival, self-protection, necessary shields in a war he never chose. But the legal framing was colder. If you're maneuvering within the system, can you claim you were only ever powerless inside it? That distinction, subtle to the public, enormous in court, loomed over everything. As hours dragged on, the judge's patience grew thinner, not in tone, but in precision. Reminders to answer directly came quicker. Interruptions came sooner. The message was unmistakable. This is not a stage for speeches. This is a place for proof. And then, finally, the moment that made headlines for a different reason. His voice broke. After another tense exchange about privacy and rights, he stopped mid-sentence, stared forward, swallowed hard, words tangled. For a few seconds, the courtroom saw not a duke, not a public figure, not a media warrior, just a man overwhelmed by reliving a fight he thought he'd already explained to the world 100 times. It was human, painfully human. But here's the brutal twist. Emotion doesn't equal evidence. Legal observers watching closely weren't focused on the tears. They were focused on the trajectory. A case that began as a moral crusade was turning into a credibility battle. And credibility, once dented, is almost impossible to polish back to shine. By the time he stepped down from the stand that day, the energy had shifted. He hadn't been shouted down. He hadn't been humiliated in some dramatic explosion. It was quieter than that, slower, like watching someone realize piece by piece that the story they've lived with for years doesn't land the same way under cross-examination. Outside the courtroom, the narrative war will rage on. Supporters will call it courage, critics will call it collapse. But inside those walls, only one thing mattered: what could be proven and what couldn't. And for the first time in this long-running battle, it felt like the ground under his version of events wasn't solid stone, it was shifting sand. By the next morning, the tension wasn't just in the courtroom, it was in the air outside it, in the cameras lined up like vultures, and the whispers curling through legal corridors. Because now this wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a slow-motion unmasking, and everyone could feel it. He returned to the stand looking more controlled, but control can be a thin disguise when pressure is relentless. The questions resumed, calm and clinical, but every single one pressed on the same bruise: the gap between the image he had built in public and the picture forming under oath. Again and again, he tried to pull the lens wide, to talk about the system, the cruelty, the culture that shaped his fear. And again, he was pulled back to the small, sharp details that refused to bend. Specific articles, specific dates, specific interactions. The courtroom didn't care about the emotional landscape. It wanted coordinates. Then came another uncomfortable layer: his own records, personal notes, communications, timelines that didn't always line up neatly with the story he told from memory. Each inconsistency on its own might have been survivable, but stacked together, they created something dangerous: doubt. Not explosive, not dramatic, just steady, creeping doubt. And doubt is poison in a credibility case. The defense didn't need to call him a liar. They didn't need raised voices or dramatic accusations. They simply placed one contradiction beside another and let the pattern speak. A forgotten message here, a different version of events there, a suggestion that some of the very press relationships he condemned were, at times, more complex than he admitted. At one point, the focus circled back to how information flowed between royal households and the media. He described feeling hunted, exposed, relentlessly targeted. But the defense gently introduced testimony suggesting that, behind the scenes, there had also been calculated efforts to manage stories, counterleaks, even shape narratives when it suited strategic needs. He didn't deny that protective measures existed. He framed them as survival tactics in a hostile environment. Shields, not swords. But the legal line being drawn was razor thin. If you are actively maneuvering within the media battlefield, even defensively, does that blur the image of being entirely powerless within it? It was a devastatingly subtle shift. Not you weren't harmed, but you weren't only harmed. And that nuance undercut the clean, one-directional victim story his case depended on. The judge's role grew more pronounced as the day wore on. Interventions came with surgical politeness, but firmer edges. When answers drifted into long emotional explanations, they were trimmed back. When speeches began forming, they were redirected to yes, no, or I don't recall. Each interruption, mild on its own, built a quiet narrative. This courtroom runs on discipline, not catharsis. You could see the strain in the way he held himself, shoulders tighter, pauses longer before answering, flashes of irritation quickly swallowed. This wasn't a television interview where empathy fills the gaps. This was a legal arena where gaps become the story. Observers noted something else too: the loneliness of his position. The institution he once represented wasn't backing him. The press he fought was sitting across from him. And now, woven into the evidence, were words and records from people who had once been in his private world, not attacking him, but not protecting his version either. They weren't there to save him. They were there to tell the truth as they knew it, and sometimes that truth didn't align with his. That isolation hung over the room like fog. Late in the proceedings, discussion returned to the emotional toll, the anxiety, the distrust, the mental spiral he said years of intrusion created. This part of his testimony was compelling, vivid, undeniably sincere. He spoke of paranoia, of constantly scanning rooms, of feeling that any private moment could become tomorrow's headline. No one in the room looked unmoved. But here's the brutal legal reality: sincerity does not automatically equal liability. You can believe every word someone says about their their pain and still question whether the defendants in this specific case legally caused it in the ways alleged. That's the canyon he couldn't quite bridge. He spoke from lived experience. The court demanded documented causation. By the time questioning wrapped, the mood was heavy, not explosive but drained, like the air after a storm that never quite breaks into rain. He stepped down again, slower this time, the fire that once fueled his public battles now looking more like exhaustion. Legal experts murmured the same quiet conclusion. The emotional force of his story remained powerful, but the structural integrity of the case had weakened. Too many inconsistencies, too many areas where memory clashed with record, too many signs that his relationship with the media, while clearly painful, was also tangled, reactive, sometimes strategic. In other words, human, complicated, not the simple moral equation the lawsuit tried to present. And that may be the most ironic twist of all. He came to court seeking a clear legal validation of a narrative built over years, a story of relentless victimhood and moral certainty. What unfolded instead was a portrait of a man shaped by trauma, yes, but also by choices, reactions, and messy entanglements that don't fit neatly into courtroom boxes. The law doesn't deal in emotional truth. It deals in provable sequences, documented actions, and tight chains of responsibility. And in that world, broad truths about suffering can fracture when pressed into narrow legal claims. As he left the courthouse, cameras flashed like lightning, trying to capture a single frame that explained everything. But there was no single frame, no dramatic victory, no total collapse, just a long, grinding realization playing out in real time. The story that wins public sympathy is not always the story that wins in court. And now, whether he intended it or not, the trial had done something irreversible. It had shifted the spotlight from what was done to him to how he himself operated inside the same system he condemned. Not a villain, not a saint, something far more dangerous in a courtroom.